Hi everyone, and welcome this evening to our IABC Queensland October event. And it's great to see everyone here face to face. So that's awesome. And also to those joining us online tonight. So a huge welcome to everyone. I'd like to just start tonight by just introducing anyone that's new here to who we are as the International Association of Business Communicators, otherwise known as IABC. So we're a vibrant global membership association, and we have many thousands of members in countries all around the world. We bring together the profession's collective disciplines and support our community with innovative thinking, shared best practices, in-depth learning and career guidance. We attract a broad range of communications professionals in Queensland, and if you haven't already, we'd love for you to join us. So here tonight are most of the IABC Queensland board directors, including myself, and I'd like to introduce, just give us a wave, please, Brooke Donovan. We have Andrew Musgrave. Melanie Loy is actually joining us online tonight, Stephen Spalding, Rianne Bell, and who am I missing? Bosco Anthony's joining us online, and also Christian Delaney, our board intern. So it obviously takes a village to organise these events, so it's great to have my board colleagues all here with me tonight. Now, just back to membership of IABC, it's actually member month this month, which means that getting a one-year professional membership to IABC is at a really, really excellent rate. So please make sure you have a look online or have a chat with myself or one of the other board members here tonight. And also, in what is a true milestone for IABC Queensland, I'd like to give a big welcome to our new video partner, RAT, who are here tonight. RAT is it's our first foray into a fully hybrid, we're live streaming tonight, as well as the people in the room. So obviously there's been no stress today whatsoever worrying about whether this would actually work. But we've got these fantastic partners with Ryan and the team from RAT, and we're really looking forward to having a great partnership into the future. So thanks very much for joining and helping us with everything tonight. Just one moment. And finally, throughout tonight's presentation, if you do have any questions you'd like to ask at the end, there's a big hint in there. We'd really like you to have some questions to ask at the end. For the Q&A with Alison, can you please use the paper and pens that have been left on all of the tables? And if you've joined us via the live stream tonight, can you please just pop those questions into the chat? And our Director of Sponsorships and Partnerships, Stefan, is going to collate all of those and give them to me to put Alison to the test a little bit later tonight following the presentation. So back to tonight's main event. Do you want to influence decision-making through building genuine relationships by using empathy? Do you want to extract maximum value from a partnership and also drive advocacy internally? Or do you want to leverage individual experiences to bring about wider change? As comms professionals, we all really need to do this. And the truth is that advocacy is an often misunderstood tool of engaging with government and other key stakeholders. However, it plays a really important role in helping us to navigate change and also in future-proofing your relationships with key stakeholders. Leading its advocacy team, our presenter is the incoming CEO of the LGAQ, the Local Government Association of Queensland, and is working with state and federal governments on the top policy positions and funding priorities critical to Queensland councils and their communities. Between 2007 to 2020, She has worked with ASX 100 companies, heading corporate affairs functions, and prior to that, worked in public and private sectors in ICT, transport, energy, police, and corrective services. She also spent 14 years as a journalist, and her current external appointments include Chair of the Brisbane Festival Board. Please join me in welcoming Alison Smith.
Hi, everyone. It is really great to be here. Can I just do a quick sound check and make sure that everyone can hear me in the room? Yep, great. Fantastic. Thank you for that really warm welcome. And can I firstly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather? And can I also say thank you to everyone who's joining us online. It is great for all of us who can be here face to face, and it's wonderful that we're at a point where we can actually bring people together and have these types of normal events again. But to those of you who are online, hello, thank you for joining us. And I'd just like to repeat as well that, yes, I would like this to be as interactive as possible. I've got a few things that I would like to say, but I would be very, very excited to take some questions tonight. So thank you in advance for that. A big thank you to the IABC for the invitation to come tonight, and particularly a big thank you to Stefan Spalding. We had this conversation maybe about a year ago about doing this, and for circumstances I won't bore you with, it's taken until tonight to get here. So I'm very excited to be here tonight. I'm going to be speaking in my capacity as the incoming CEO of the Local Government Association of Queensland. The association, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is the single biggest peak body that is representative of local government across the state. There are 77 councils right across Queensland, and they provide the services, the community offerings, the community livability of all Queenslanders. So I'm very honoured to have this role. Tonight, I would like to talk about the fact that all of us have a role, not just as those who practice advocacy, but we actually have a role in communicating and educating to people what that advocacy is. You might be in roles today where those that you report to, your boards, your management team, they don't necessarily understand what advocacy is all about. So tonight I'd like to perhaps give you a few tips and tricks in terms of language that you can use with them to be able to explain what it is that we do and debunk a few of the myths. So I'll talk about what it is, why it's so important. It actually should be something that is well understood, but today it still remains some grey areas for many of the people that we work with. So let's start. And as you've heard, I'm someone whose career has been very much focused on driving the best outcomes for others. And I'm very, very pleased and proud when around about this time last year, I started at the LGAQ as the head of advocacy. When I started my career, I started out as a cadet journalist. I was 17 years old, straight out of high school. And I quickly realised that as a journalist, you have a role where beyond the basics of journalism, beyond the basics of the who, what, when, where, how, and why, and beyond the basics of trying to be the one that tells the story in the most convincing way so that everyone tunes into your version of the story rather than others, and that's where ratings comes into play. Beyond all of that, advocacy is a core element of journalism. So why do I say that? It's simply because that when you're a journalist, you are ultimately telling other people's stories. You think about the local news each night or what you see on your Facebook feeds. The stories in the news are ultimately about those sorts of people who defied all odds and achieved an outcome for their sector. Or it's about the person who escaped from some horrible calamity. Yeah, sure. Okay. Is that a little bit better? Great. Do you want me to start from the top? No? Okay. All right. So I'll just recap in terms of, the fundamentals of journalism. You quickly realize that you're telling the stories of other people. It's when someone has been the hero of a terrible, terrible disaster, and they're telling the story of what they did. or indeed the one of the victims, one of the survivors of the disaster who've gone on to live beyond what they've experienced, and yet they're fighting for health insurance. And so you're advocating for them on their behalf. There are so many different personal stories that come out of news environments where, as a journalist, you're telling that story to be able to try to right the wrongs or correct a circumstance or to achieve change for someone. So in many ways, that's why I say that journalism is very akin to being an advocate. And that's why, as those of us who are in the communications profession or in advocacy, the business of advocacy, it's why we use the media as a tool, because it's an important way of getting that story across. So after journalism, I then moved into state politics as a senior media advisor. And in that capacity, my role was ultimately to try to communicate to the broader masses different policy announcements, different initiatives, different programs, community outcomes. And again, telling the story for others so that those who heard the stories might benefit from them. And then fast forward through the years that followed, and as it's been explained in the introduction, I was working in corporate affairs for a number of ASX-listed companies, and they were in heavy regulated sectors where just through the nature of being heavily regulated, you needed to have very extensive and frequent communications into government. It could be everything from, what you needed to do, working with other levels of government to achieve an environment that then enabled that business that I worked for to be able to get on and do its business. For example, how I have in the past legislated to find circumstances that may not have been predicted by those who drafted legislation, yet in years later, you've got circumstances with unintended consequences for those who are operating in that space. What you do to then try to achieve change that is positive change, that upholds the intent of the legislation, but delivers the outcome that those who are in those sectors need. Or it might have been how you would advocate for approvals for projects that would lead to thousands of jobs, projects that would lead to economic benefits, but how you would actually get the green light for those projects. Indeed, it might even have been how you win community support for initiatives to ensure that what a company is driving is well understood and appreciated. I mentioned the phrase before about the business of advocacy. Is it a business? This is something that I wanted to explore just quickly tonight. So let me move to the first slide of the deck I have prepared. I Googled advocacy online, and let me say I got 584 million results. The first definition was this. So as you can see, it came up as, what is advocacy? It is speaking, acting and writing. It is promoting, protecting and defending. It's about being on someone's side. It's about being concerned with someone's fundamental needs. Now, sorry for everyone online. I can only do this with those in the room, but can I take a bit of a pulse check with everyone? What do you think of that definition? Hands up if you think it covers what advocacy is, what it looks like. I'm getting a few shakes of the head. I'm getting a few shrugs of the shoulders. Okay. So when I saw that definition of advocacy, and let me tell you, that was the top one that came up of the first 584 million, I wasn't actually convinced. I didn't think that advocacy is just about the disadvantaged. I didn't think that it's, always about those with, have a look at it, being on someone's side, protecting, defending. To me, advocacy is actually about how you tell the stories of the misunderstood. When there's something that is clearly not understood by others, the less understood, about the unintended consequences that need to be rectified, the opportunities that need to be realised. That to me is more about advocacy. So then I looked at what came up as number 2, which is this one. So as you can see, promote interests or causes, arguing for, recommending, supporting a cause, a policy, helping people find their voice. They're the ones who have the story to tell. Self-advocacy about oneself, individual advocacy, and systems advocacy, which is more about, what I spoke about before, when you're advocating for the employers and for the sectors and for their stakeholders. To me, this was a much better explanation of what advocacy is truly about. And so for me, as someone who in a matter of weeks will become LGAQ's next CEO, I have pledged that I will be an advocacy-led CEO. For me in the LGAQ, our advocacy is critical, and it is critical that it is always steeped in evidence. It must be evidence-based. It's about finding the facts that show why certain circumstances may not be working or why something needs to be fixed. And then you tell that story to your decision makers in the most compelling way. But it's not just about telling the story, and it is certainly not about whinging. It's always about explaining and offering a pathway, going in and showing that you have thought about the issue, you've got a solution. It may not be ultimately the solution that is chosen, but you have actually thought about how it could be rectified. So how is this then different to being, say, a lobbyist or to someone who is in a corporate relations role? I think ultimately it is about we're all working in the same framework. And I've just put up here some 4 basic principles of what I think that framework looks like. Identifying the issue, hanging a lantern on that issue, seeking an outcome to resolve that issue, and then how you actually achieve that outcome. This is a common framework, and there are many nuances to how advocacy works within that framework. It is certainly a lot more complex than just 4 basic steps, but these are the 4 basic principles that underlie what all of us are trying to achieve, whether it's in the boardroom, with the executive team, with our stakeholders. I used to use the term that advocacy was a two-way street. It's who you're representing, it's their view, and it's the decision maker's view. But I've grown to learn that advocacy is more like a spaghetti junction when you've got a whole myriad of roads going in whole different directions. And I say that because actually advocacy is about strapping in for the ride and being open to the new roads that open up that you may not even see right at the get-go. Advocacy definitely benefits from a framework, having those fundamentals, those basic principles that guide you. But you really need to be open to what comes in your advocacy. Sometimes it can be a really short journey. Sometimes you've got issues that take years to be fully fleshed out. For those of you in the room who have been looking at legislative changes or legislative reviews, that can take a very long time. And what all of us in this business need to be mindful of is the fact that there are policy windows that can open as quickly as they close. And when they open, you need to be prepared to jump through them. It means that you need to be prepped and ready to go. And when something external happens and that window opens, you're in there. Ultimately, I think the real difference is how you apply the framework, and that comes down to your approach. And most importantly, that comes down to your relationship with stakeholders. And that's what I really want to focus on tonight. So when I started out as that 17-year-old cadet journalist working for a newspaper, one of the really crusty old cranky journos that I spent a bit of time with gave me 2 pieces of advice, and you can see them up on the screen. His words were, go the extra mile and walk in the shoes of your stakeholders. So while this was media advice, this is advice I have carried through all of my career, and absolutely it is relevant being head of advocacy and coming in as an advocacy-led CEO. The first one, going the extra mile, to me, this is about leaving no stone unturned. It's about finding the best evidence to be able to support your advocacy. Advocacy is about compelling storytelling, and we've touched on that already. And we've also talked about how it's not about whinging. It's not about complaining. It's actually about delivering a compelling story that is basis that you can use to convince those who can help you find a pathway to achieve it. Crafting a compelling message takes effort. What I really wanted to, I guess, in this little piece on this slide talk through is that, it's no good any of us simply picking up what others before us have done and delivering. In advocacy, it's about finding what has not been said before. It's about finding not what was done the last time, but finding a new angle, how you can find something that's just a little bit more compelling, it's a bit more contemporary, it's a bit more interesting. It's about asking questions until you feel that you know everything about a topic, and therefore you're well prepped and you can answer the questions that come back to you. It's about how you tip a complex issue on its head, you shake it out, and you see what else is left that perhaps hasn't been looked at before. Find out what third parties are saying. It's not just about what you do. Have a look in the external environment. Find those content experts and ask them to take you through it step by step. Challenge them on why they did things in the past. Challenge them on what the future looks like. Black hat them on all those but what if questions. Keep asking questions because curiosity will be rewarded. So let's give you an example of this one. Okay. It's a bit fuzzy, apologies for that. But go back to the year 2010 who was the Prime Minister back in 2010? Any guesses? No, it was not John Howard. Kevin Rudd. Yes, it was a Queensland. Kevin Rudd, we're here to help. It was him. Back in the day, back in 2010, I was working in the mining sector. He was Prime Minister. But there was a particular policy that came down that year, a proposal, and that was that the federal government announced it was going to introduce a mining industry super profits tax. So back then, the mining industry was in a boom, making lots of money, delivering lots of royalties to the governments. But the federal government saw that it was actually an opportunity to get more back. And the government announced its intention. And the mining industry had never been consulted about this. It was taken completely by surprise. So how did the industry react? Its first reaction was to retaliate and out-evidence the government. So what you can see here is one of the many protests that happened, and it was probably a good 6 to 8 months of protest activity across the state. A lot of it, across the country. A lot of it was focused in Canberra in front of Parliament House. And I think that this was one of those. But why do I say that the industry was out to out-evidence the government? It's because on one hand, the government was thinking that introducing this super profits tax on an industry that was just making billions of dollars, that the public would totally understand, and that the public would naturally agree that rich miners should be paying more. They should be, paying more. Look at their multi-billion-dollar profits. Of course, they should pay more. However, the mining industry, and it used all of its corporate affairs people like me who was working at Rio Tinto, so all the companies like back then, Xstrata and BHP, Rio Tinto, all of them, it went to its corporate affairs people and said, we need a way to fight this. And basically what we did was we flipped that on its head, and we demonstrated that actually this was a tax that was going to rob from the rich to pay the poor. It would be a tax that would reduce the profits of those mining companies that were just making billions of dollars in royalty. It would reduce their ability to employ the number of people that they did. It would reduce the number of jobs of the suppliers who, that they use their goods and services for. The list went on and on of all the reductions. The minute that you start doing that, in an evidence-led campaign where we heavily used third-party advocates, we advocated against the tax by detailing it as how it would kill the golden goose. Oh, We've looked at, say, this is a tax that would kill the golden goose. So myself and many other corporate affairs people worked on this together. Working together grew our muscle. We doubled down and we became singular focused. That same story was then told in every mining community, in every public bar, from Blackwater to Muswellbrook to Port Hedland. Employees, mums and dads, mining workers, equipment manufacturers, the local bakeries, they all told the same message. They all had the same story to tell. Now, in the background, all of those mining companies spent millions of dollars engaging some of the best campaign minds in the business to create really amazing creative. And all of that took the government by surprise. What happened was it became a story about jobs, about the survival of mining community towns, survival of indirect suppliers, the net sector. What the campaign did was show how economically important the mining sector was to Australia, to all of Australia. Fast forward now to 2021, it's quite a different public sentiment out there in many parts of the company, at least when it comes to coal mining. But I guess that example shows a whole range of elements that came together that was used in successful advocacy. So what were the lessons that we learned from all of that? Well, if we go from 1 to 5, I think that example hopefully has shown you that it's about finding a different angle to that's being used against you. It's about how you can corral third parties who share your view and how you find that alignment and that synergy and bringing them into the advocacy with you. It's about how you build muscle. This was something that we knew was not an overnight thing. It was not a 1 week, a 2 week, or 1 month. It was a long haul. And so therefore, if you're up for a marathon, not a sprint, you need to build muscle. It's about how you get expertise when you need it. And that was how the sector actually brought in some of those amazing advertising and campaign geniuses to help. But it's also about asking questions, especially the what if question. So that second piece of advice that I got was about always walking in your stakeholders' shoes. And to me, this is really, really critical when we talk about understanding your stakeholders, building relationships with them, and getting the best out of those relationships. I think all too often people think that they have just one story to tell and that it's the story of those who they represent or indeed of their own plight. And I say that that's wrong. I say that a one-sided argument will only get you a one-sided response. Rather, I think that advocacy is about how you can get improved outcomes. And in my experience, how you can get the best win from an issue that you've been advocating comes not just from the outcome that you want, but how you can wrap that up to get improvement for many stakeholders. Of course, you need to use your advocacy framework to identify what that looks like, what good looks like, and then go for that. But the victory of achieving your advocacy outcomes will be much sweeter when others are not left with a sour taste in your mouth. In fact, that others find that what you're suggesting, the pathway that you've proposed, it actually tastes pretty good. Then what you will achieve is not a one-sided outcome. You've actually got a multiple benefit outcome. And that's especially important when you may need to be dealing with the same stakeholder on a new issue in the future. What do I mean by this? So this slide, okay, it's not just about men in lycra. It's to depict an episode that I experienced in my most recent role when I was working at the Star Entertainment Group. That company, as most of you would know, is building the $3.6 billion Queen's Wharf project. And I've got that slide up there because at one point we had to close the Bicentennial Bikeway. And you know how, back in the day it used to be corporate golf and now it's all about corporate cycling. We've got a lot of cyclists in Brisbane and there are a lot of people who are not that happy about having the Bicentennial path closed. Ultimately, it was being closed because that bikeway that runs along the city edge, along the foreshore, works needed to be done along that foreshore to then improve the new bikeway. And while that bikeway would be deviated through the back of QUT while the works on the foreshore were happening, cyclists weren't happy. And the cycling community has a pretty loud voice. Their loud voice was pretty effective at 1 William Street as well, and that was a bit of a problem. So we had to essentially use that advocacy framework, those 4 principles, and work out how do we win the hearts and minds to convince people that we need to make a change until a brand new, safe, improved outcome is built. So it meant that we actually had to go to those squeaky wheels, pardon the pun, and work with the stakeholders to get their input into a long-term design. We had to work with them to map out what that interim would look like until we could get to the end result. So we literally had to walk in the footsteps of our stakeholders. And remember, that was my second piece of advice. We literally had to do that because we had to take some of the leads from the cycling communities, Bugs and others, and walk the path of the deviation, which we would take cyclists on while the work was being carried out, to make them accept and understand how it would look, be happy with it, and then advocate it to their members. And so we took them on the walk and they showed us things like, well, that pathway is really uneven and that's a safety risk. And what about that tree over there? Because, you know, a cyclist will be coming around the corner and that tree is like smack bang next to the pathway. That's really dangerous. There's a blind spot over there. And what about this traffic? And so all these issues were identified. And as a result, the Destination Brisbane Consortium, which is delivering the project, had to take all of that into effect and map out a deviation that was different from what was originally proposed, deviation that was more expensive. It meant that the tree over there had to be completely wrapped in reflective fluoro tape for day and night cycling because you could move the tree. But, you know, all those changes, yes, they cost more than was first anticipated, but what we achieved was acceptance in the end. And we achieved some quieter corridors in 1 William Street. So I think in this example, what were the lessons that we learned? It was probably, to me, just this one that, you know, achieving an improvement that is not just for those who you work for, but it's actually for all of your stakeholders, is the best outcome. You're not just getting a singular objective, you're bringing a lot more people on the journey and you're delivering an outcome that actually suits them. So it was a problem shared, it was a problem solved in many ways, a win-win. It's the ability of how you can drive change, but one that comes with multiple benefits, not just starting from a singular premise. This is one of my last slides, and it's about stakeholder relationships, but it's probably the key of what I would like to talk about tonight. And I've got here a number of principles. So our stakeholder relationships are the most important things that we have in advocacy. Yes, we can be great communicators. We can be very skilled writers and gifted with, compelling campaigns, but it's all about the relationships. Understanding your stakeholders and working with them to get outcomes, not just focusing on the singular. Advocacy, the first one, is around being evidence-led, because if you are based on facts, that's really hard to dispute. Accuracy is everything, and it's from accuracy that you will actually build trust with your stakeholders. And then, of course, you take trust. Well, trust is critical with your stakeholders. If they don't believe you, then you've got zero influence. So knowing your stakeholders as well is critical. And I say that because if you're known to your stakeholders, if you're familiar, if you've taken the time to get to know them, if you've taken the time to get to communicate with them, and frequently, not just to tick the box, but frequently, that goes a long way when you need to have robust discussions. If you can build a personal relationship with your stakeholders, that is singularly the best way to go about it. But let's face it, sometimes you don't have the time to get to know them. Sometimes you are thrust into an emerging situation and you literally have to go and speak to someone about a problem, and it's the first meeting that you have. I'm getting a lot of nods in the room. Is anyone game to say how they've tackled that problem before? Yes.
On rail projects, infrastructure projects, and yeah, absolutely going in for the first time to understand what someone's issue is. So I think it's being able to say, well, what is the problem?
Great. So for those online, if you didn't hear that, it's about empathy, about going in and listening. Listening is an absolute key part of advocacy. Great answer. Thank you. If you don't know someone and you find yourself in a first environment meeting, demonstrate to them how you have kind of got to know them because you've found out about them. Go into that meeting and relay to them about them. It will show that you've actually taken the time to do some homework. You've looked into things that they may have done, said, been reported about, and you can relay that back to them, and they'll know that you've actually taken the time to get to know them, even if you haven't met before. That goes a long way, and it shows that they're important to you. Respecting your stakeholders is also another important factor. So how I say, we all know that sometimes you're trying not to whinge, you're trying not to complain, but you're trying to get an outcome. And it might be a really robust discussion that gets you that outcome. So my rule of thumb is respecting your stakeholders means respectful greetings in public and robust discussions in private. It's never helpful to engage in a public or media slanging match. There can sometimes be a need or a reason, but as a general rule of thumb, that's not how you're going to build those relationships and get those, those outcomes when you're going to be able to achieve things for multiple stakeholders. And then I'd say finally, after that little sermon about advocating behind closed doors, finally, don't get personal. This is not a personal thing when you're in the business of advocacy. This is about policies. It's about decisions. It's about politics. It's not about the person. It's never smart to burn bridges when the next week you might be in there because you have to build a road. So for me, these were the key things that I wanted to touch on tonight, but I was particularly keen to have Q&A. It's always preferable to have a really interactive session. And, if I've given you a few reasons tonight and perhaps your key takeaways are going the extra mile and how that can really help you in your advocacy and also walking the shoes of your stakeholders, then I will feel like I've, done a good thing for you tonight, because to me, these are really important elements of how to drive real change through advocacy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alison. So while you've been speaking tonight, we have had a few questions come through that I am going to read from my phone that have been sent to me. So, but before we actually get into that, the first thing that I was actually wondering, I wanted just to kick off the discussion with, was you spoke, I know, about being an advocacy-led CEO, and that's your firm commitment at the LGAQ when you go in and take up your new role. And I suppose it just made me wonder, what do you think the first thing that you'll demonstrate that by? What might that be with your team and in the organisation?
Sure. Am I still okay to talk on only this? Okay, great. Well, remembering that I work for a member association, so our most important stakeholders are our members. Therefore, to be an advocacy-led CEO is about how I can demonstrate the importance of meeting with, listening, and following up for my members. So that's, a really critical thing. And of course, coming out of the advocacy team that we have, and that's their sole focus, it's a matter of how, as a CEO, I can back them in, how, I can support them in the work that they're doing, because they're already practicing in that field. But it's about, making sure that that is seen as I guess, my stamp, what I will bring to the role, that it's always about being in there, having the conversation, listening, fighting the good fight. That yes, I have a team to do that, but that I'm very, very committed as a CEO to be backing them in on that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alison. And look, we've had a couple of questions come in on one topic that I think everyone in this room will be really familiar with already, and that is the 2032 Olympics, Brisbane. So there you are, Alison, head of LGAQ, sitting there. What's happening in the lead up? What's going on? What do you foresee? What do you think might be the challenges or those opportunities?
Great question. How exciting. Every morning, those of us who live in Brisbane and Queensland, predominantly SEQ, but we wake up and we're waking up in an Olympic city. That is the coolest thing ever. So I think, there's a long road ahead. We've got quite a few years to bring things together, but certainly it's the case where the governments, state and federal, will be busy putting together their organising committees that will drive the Olympics. We've seen this week, or late last week rather, the announcement of a few portfolio changes in the current state government, how certain ministers and indeed the Premier will be focused on different aspects of the Games. And I think as that works, there are natural pieces around the infrastructure that needs to be built, around the funding, around the actual getting on board and becoming Olympics focused and moving the community. And that last piece about moving the community is one where we need to get some movement happening quickly, because this is an Olympics for the state. It's not an Olympics just for SEQ, and you'd be familiar with the fact that there are already some of the events that have been forecast in other regions outside SEQ. But for me, working with our local communities across Queensland, all of those Queenslanders who are involved in different pursuits, be they tourism, suppliers, our First Nations community, our cultural and artistic performers, I think those are the areas that have not yet really surfaced as opportunities that will benefit from the Olympics. And so I'm really keen to see how we can explore those and start working on them sooner rather than later, because can you imagine if you had every Olympics event, corporate hosting and dinners and awards nights and all of those wonderful things. Can you imagine if every single one of those showcased Queensland produce, our amazing seafood, our tropical fruits, our incredible beef, all of those things? If all of that could showcase the flavours of Queensland, what an amazing opportunity for our producers, our growers, our manufacturers. And then what if every event had cultural performances from our First Nations communities and artistic performances from, the regional pockets of Queensland? To me, this is, as the Olympics, yes, there's the sport, which is amazing, and the global spotlight, but for our state, it's the opportunity to really put a spotlight on our DNA, what makes us special. Why are all these Southerners wanting to move to Queensland? We have a great lifestyle, we have an amazing state, and within that sits all of these elements of, produce and supply and service and hospitality. So I would really like to find ways sooner rather than later to start to explore those as part of the Olympics movement that quite naturally in years getting closer to the event starts to take fruition.
How fantastic. It is an exciting time to be a Queenslander, and what an exciting opportunity for you in your role coming up. We've actually had a question coming from Jamie English, who's online, who's actually asked around, Alison, what do you think is the role and importance of advocacy in local government today? And how did you manage the shift from corporate affairs into advocacy?
Thank you. And thank you. Great question. So I'm going to start with the later and come to the former. So the shift, I don't see it as a big shift, because what I was doing in my previous role was advocating for great tourism outcomes for Queensland and working in with the Queensland government. And then when COVID hit, I was advocating for ways to support those tourism workers who had been stood down and lobbying heavily for JobKeeper and various other initiatives. So still working with federal and state governments, and now I'm working for local government. We still are advocating to state and federal government for multiple things, for services, for funding. It is a fact that local government can only raise money through the rates that you pay and any fees and charges that a council is able to apply. We don't have all of those other big taxes that collectively across state and federal government amount to 97% of the taxes that we pay. Local government gets 3% of that. So one of the absolute priorities of advocacy for local government is about getting a higher share of officers to be able to then deliver services for the community. Local government, as the third tier of government, is the one that is the closest to community. It's the one where most people have an interface with. It's rates, it's rubbish, it's roads, but it's a whole lot more than that. And certainly in COVID, we've seen how local government has played a big role. It's been part of the encouraging vaccination. It's been providing community facilities to use as vaccination hubs, but a whole lot more initiatives to support small business through COVID. And so as a result, that's really where my priorities have been at the moment for local government. Having said that, there's a whole lot more. Local government to me amazes me in terms of the diversity of issues that get thrown at you. I said before, roads, rates, rubbish, that's how most people think of in local government, but it's so much more. It's, every day we have, issues of councils who are having to provide childcare in regional Queensland because government, as in state or federal government, have walked away, and private sector providers have walked away because it's no longer commercial. And so you find that local government steps into roles that are not really part of its remit, but they're roles where they simply have to become a provider of last resort, because if they don't do it, then no one else is doing it for the communities. That's what gets me really passionate about local government, because ultimately it is there fighting hard for the people across Queensland. And, it's sometimes doing it in very, very challenging circumstances with incredibly limited funding. So if you ask me about priorities, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, here, Alison. I think that's, definitely in terms of, definitely the needs of particularly communities, I think, that have been affected by COVID, particularly at the moment, over the last, 18 months, 2 years. They're really going to need someone in their corner, and I think that you're absolutely that person. I'd just like to throw now to the room. If anyone who hasn't asked a question yet would like to, please let us know now. Yes, fantastic. You're first.
You touched on briefly before about how many members are your primary stakeholder and how many councils there are across Queensland. One of the issues I've always encountered in various roles is around the perceived or real separation between SEQ and regional Queensland. How do you balance that in the advocacy you do for your members?
Thanks. Great question. Ultimately, our advocacy comes down to democracy. And in 3 short weeks' time from now, we will have our annual conference where we get all of the councils across the state. So every 77 councils are members of LGAQ, and we get them together, and they will have put together the most important topics to them that they put to a conference floor for votes. So how it works is all councils have the ability to put forward motions. Those motions get debated on the conference floor. Those motions that have more than a 50% support get carried. And under our constitution, those motions that are carried become binding. And so for the LGAQ, whatever is supported and passed, that becomes our mandate to deliver. So it means that rural and remote, regional, First Nations, SEQ councils, everyone has the ability to put forward what they see as their most important issues. There is no limit on the number of issues they put forward. Can I tell you that this year we had over 130 different wish list requests. So those will all go to conference, and through the democracy of the membership, they will work out which ones they wish to support, and then that's how we do it. So it will quite obviously mean that there'll be a mix of motions. Some will be absolutely statewide, some will be regional groupings of councils, some will be just SEQ focused. It's what the membership wants that they support that we then do, and that's the best way.
Fantastic.
Alison, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I need a little bit of advice. It actually is a question spawned by a conversation earlier with Gail and Harminder here. At the start of your talk, you were talking about, I'm just going to read off my paper, evidence-based solutions in advocacy. And I think now more than ever, we're seeing that scientific evidence is more subjective than objective. Everyone has their own alternative facts. And even in the program that I'm working on, we have some stakeholders who just fundamentally disagree with the science that we're putting forward. And I'm wondering how I can navigate advocacy in that environment.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, I did ask you for a question earlier and you've given me a doozy, thanks. And yes, the challenges and the complexity of advocacy. And this is when I go back to that spaghetti junction reference that I made, that, you know, there are so many pathways and so many different stakeholders. And look, the evidence is hard to ignore, but, you know, increasingly the public sentiment is another big factor. And I don't know what the issue is that you're dealing with. I don't think we need to know for the purposes of having this chat. But at the end of the day, if you can get a body of evidence that is, you know, reputable, that's first and foremost what you need. Then what I would do is I would then look to third-party advocacies and get case studies from them. So you would get personal anecdotes from a multitude of stakeholders. So you've got your evidence-based, and if it's scientific or economic or whatever that might look like, you have your evidence base. Then you go for the practicalities from how it hits on the ground, stories from your stakeholders, people who might be prepared to go forwards. That's a really important part, because that actually starts to bring out that community sentiment of how something may or may not be impacting in life. And then beyond that, it'd be, to me, I'd be looking for who might be sponsors. So who might be out there that has a bit of a profile that you could actually involve and get their support on, brief them, see how they feel, see if they're prepared to add their voice to it. And then all of a sudden you're starting to build up a really strong base. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A great answer to a good question.
We'll go to Sinead. Sure.
Thank you, and thank you, Alison. Excellent presentation, as always. I'm going to take you back to your early days as a journalist, and I'm really interested in, every year I look at the Edelman Trust Barometer to see where people are placing their trust in society. And for me, it feels like the fourth estate in the media has diminished year on year on year in the context of people going there for truth. And in fact, last year, again, employers became the most trusted place for people to go to get truths and to get what they need. So I want to get your views on what you think is happening in the world of the fourth estate, which I see as critical to our society, and how we get that back to a place where people have comfort.
Mm. Thank you. So I'm going to say thanks, Sinead. I wish I had the answer to that. I don't categorically, but I suppose I'm happy to share a couple of views. In the role that I was in prior to LGAQ, part of my team was in internal communications, and as it has been in other roles that I've had, so when I worked at Rio Tinto and others, and you know the importance of having company messaging and having regular messaging and having leadership from the top and having your CEO and your managers all sharing information and being visible and communicative goes beyond anything. That is everyone who works for the business, that's their primary source of truth. If it's not there, you create a vacuum and then people invent their own truth. So in a workforce, internal communications has probably never been more important than it is now. And that's why I get really excited when you see people who have been like former journalists or former communicators who all of a sudden are sitting on the C-suite in big companies, because you just think that's great. Their skills, which are now so recognised as being important to the culture and the fabric, and the getting the right trust from people within organisations, is now being achieved. And I think possibly my light bulb moment was when Jeff Dixon did that on the Qantas board, and I thought, that's great. Let there be many more after him, and there certainly have been. But taking it to the media side, and look, as a former journalist, it's very saddening to see what's happening with the traditional media, to see the demise of regional newspapers, to see the demise of regional television, even metropolitan TV is cutting back, and of course nowadays you've got social media, which when I was a journalist didn't exist. I think I left in 2001 when that was all coming into play. And you can't ignore it. Obviously, you see what TV stations are doing now where, yes, they have free to air and they're broadcasting the news at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. Possibly not that many people who are home then and watching the news. So instead, they're using the social platforms to still put out those stories and those broadcasts. And I can only think that that's more of what we'll see. That we've got new channels, new platforms. They're the ones that will be increasingly used. I can't really predict what's going to happen beyond that. I don't know. I'm going to throw that out to the room. Does anyone have a particular view on that I can't answer tonight?
Citizen journalist.
Did you want to comment? The comment was citizen journalist.
Well, I think that's sort of it's scary. I was talking to a young girl today who's doing journalism at QUT, and we were talking about various things, and she was talking about how to be able to trace things. I work at the archives. We were talking about old stories and things that are in the archives, and I was likening a particular story to Gabby Petito and the difference now being that the whole world is piled on, and it's become media fodder rather than that they're forgetting the people involved in the story and things like that. So that's what was the concern with citizen journalists. But I actually do have a question. It'll
Great.
I wanted to ask about engagement with First Nations communities, and do you change your approach at all? Is there anything else you would do? Do you approach it slightly differently?
Thank you. So we have an amazing couple of people at LGAQ who work with First Nations communities, and what makes them amazing is the amount of time that they invest. These are people who spend years getting to know those communities, spending time, spending not days but weeks at a time with those communities, and listening. There's a lot of listening that goes on. And from there, it's, I guess what I see from their great success is how they listen to the problem and then how they offer really simple solutions or pathways, but it's never about telling people what to do. So I have the absolute luxury of observing from some of the best, and that's their approach.
Thank you, Alison. I know you said through your presentation that it really was all about relationships, and I think that's just come through in every one of those stories that you told us tonight. And look, on behalf of everyone who has joined us for tonight's event, I think that was just so insightful. And thank you so much for joining IABC Queensland and presenting for us tonight. Please
Thank you.
Give Alison a big round of applause.
Thank you.
We'll stay with us for a little while after. I have sort of a chat with everyone who's here. But before we go, Alison, would you be so kind as to draw our lucky door prizes? So get out your tickets. It's open to everyone who's in the room. We do have something that our prizes are drinkable. So there you are.
How could you lose on that? Okay, so the ticket I have drawn is black, B03.
Anticipation, come on down. It's like the price is right at the end here, but we do the lucky door prize, the bottles of wine. And now we've got just one more, please, Alison.
Yes.
Yes, well done.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
And that one.
And just while I'm drawing this, we were talking about this before at that table. The wall. Is the wall on an angle or what's going on? Okay, this one is black. Also B, very close, 01.
Fantastic. Please come on, we can for you also. You're a winner tonight. So looking everyone on your tables, and also for our live stream audience tonight, we do have this QR code, which I think everyone's done once or twice by now. But this one is a bit more fun in that we'd love your feedback on tonight's event so that we can continue to really bring you fabulous speakers like Alison, and also to hear the topics that you really want to know about from IABC. So if you wouldn't mind pulling out your phones and taking a scan of that code and just please completing that. It'll just take a minute. That 1 minute survey for us, it's really valuable information. And last but not least, I did also just want to give a quick shout out for our next event, which is, and don't we all need it, our Nearly Christmas party. Hallelujah this year. I don't think anyone will ever enjoy Christmas parties and Christmas functions as much as they will this year. But it's going to be again at the Storybridge Hotel. It's a fantastic night of networking and we do have so much to celebrate and be grateful for. So we really, really love to see you all there. That's on the 25th of November. And our tickets are on sale at the moment. They're going live. They're going live tomorrow. So there you go. You've heard it here first tonight. So we'd love to see all of you here. If you are an IABC member as well, you're free to come along. So please make sure you do. Okay, and thank you so much again, Alison.
Thanks,
all the
Alicia.
very best for starting your new role. Can't wait to see what you do. I think if there's any cyclists around, look out. It's all going to be okay. And also all the great work that no doubt you'll do in the lead up to the Olympics to really help promote those causes out for all the councils across Queensland. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
That's the end of tonight's event. So everyone, stay safe and we'll see you next time. Thank you.